What are the fundamental forces of nature and how do they arise? This is getting exciting. In this video, we explore what the Fibonacci 60-digit clock really is and how it gives rise to all the fundamental forces of nature used to generate the complex world we see around us. Don't worry if this starts to sound too technical or complicated. Simply follow the narrative, and by the end you will see how profound and intuitive it really is. In the standard model of physics, there are four fundamental forces of nature which hold the entire universe together. Those four forces are the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity. But science cannot tell you where those forces come from. They do, however, suspect that at some point in time, right before the moment of creation, which they call the Big Bang, those four forces were all part of a single primordial force, which then split into four. In the last video, I explained how the forces generated inside a computer-simulated world are not real, but only mathematically created using binary code. A character inside a virtual computer world can be affected by the force of gravity or even electrocuted by a beam of energy inside that virtual world as though they were real forces. But this only happens because that character is created from the same underlying mathematical code. I then suggested that this holds true for our own universe. I postulated that our four fundamental forces are also not real forces, but merely the product of sophisticated coded mathematical information. We perceive these forces as being real because, like the characters inside a virtual world, we are also created from the same source code that generates our universe. Now take a look at the Fibonacci 60-digit clock that was created using the Fibonacci series. At first glance, we can see 60 numbers around the circumference of a circle. We know from the first videos in this series that there is a ton of mathematical information encoded into those 60 numbers. I suggest that this circle of 60 numbers, which form a perfect human clock, is in fact the primordial building block of all of reality. This is the source of the four fundamental forces of nature. Those forces are simply the product of super-intelligent programming. This is not merely a circle of numbers, but is in fact a wave of mathematical information encoded into the very fabric of the universe, and this is what gives rise to the electromagnetic field described in physics. But how can this circle of numbers be a wave? The first thing you should know about the electromagnetic field is that it is made up of an electrical field and a magnetic field that run perpendicular to each other. What does that mean? The two fields or waves run at 90-degree angles to each other. If we look at this Fibonacci clock head-on, we see a circle of 60 numbers. Here I have animated a particle moving around the circumference of this circle. From this point of view, it doesn't really look like a wave of energy, right? But what happens when I flip this Fibonacci clock 90 degrees to our line of sight? What do we see then? Now we can see that same particle moving around the circle in what looks more like a traditional wave of information. As the particle moves around the circle, it moves up and down from 0 to 9. Amazingly, the particle now also seems to have an intrinsic energy as it rises and falls. Here is an animation showing the Fibonacci clock rotating 90 degrees so you can see how the perspective changes. This is what I believe simulates the electrical field. It is caused by this fluctuating wave of information which produces a type of simulated energy. Now, if we go back to the front view and we connect all the numbers running across the nucleus of this circle, we can see that they all add up to 10. I believe that this information is bonded in pairs of 10 and are mathematically linked across the nucleus of this circle. Each pair, therefore, has two opposite poles. For this part, try to imagine sets of opposing teams involved in a tug of war pulling on a rope that is running through the nucleus of this circle. This is what creates the opposing forces, or opposite poles of the magnetic force. So now we have the mathematical information that simulates an electric force, and we have the mathematical information that simulates a magnetic force, with the two forces existing perpendicular or 90 degrees to each other. Together they generate the electromagnetic force. In this state, the entire circle or wave of information is being held in perfect balance, and all the virtual or simulated forces are in complete harmony. Running across the nucleus of this wave, we have the bonded pairs. We have 9 pulling on 1, 8 pulling on 2, 7 on 3, 6 on 4, and 5 on 5. Because 9 is much larger than 1, it will generate a stronger pull on the 1. With 8 and 2, it will be the same attractive force across the nucleus, only slightly weaker. And so on down to 6 and 4, with the force getting weaker as the values grow closer together. This is what will later mathematically simulate the strong and weak nuclear forces. They manifest from this mathematical relationship across the nucleus of this wave between opposing sets of information linked in pairs. But in the case of 5 and 5, the two poles are evenly matched. If you think of two perfectly balanced teams in a tug of war, the two sides will cancel each other out and there will be zero force between them. This is why the 5s act like zeros and are able to form bonds with other Fibonacci waves of information. So now we have mathematically simulated the electromagnetic force made up of the electrical and magnetic waves running perpendicular to each other, and we have accounted for the strong and weak nuclear forces running across the nucleus of this wave of information. We have now mathematically described 3 out of the 4 fundamental forces encoded into the Fibonacci 60-digit clock. Note that in this state the forces are all being held in perfect balance inside this circle. Hence they do not manifest as separate forces but as one primordial entity. But what about gravity? Of all the forces of nature, this is the one that stumps physicists the most. They cannot reconcile gravity between quantum physics and classical physics. They have no idea what gives a particle its mass. Einstein suggested that gravity might be caused by a warping of space-time. Other physicists think there might be an as yet undiscovered particle called a graviton, which gives particles their mass. And others think mass is caused by a particle's motion through the Higgs field. I suggest that mass and gravity, like all the other forces, is not a real force, but is rather being mathematically generated right here in the Fibonacci clock. Remember part 3 of this series. In that video we saw that if we split the Fibonacci 60-digit clock down its central axis and divided the two halves with each other and then cubed the result, it somehow magically generated the number 0.5972. And the mass of the Earth just happens to be 5.972 times 10 to the power 24 kilograms. The mathematical probability of this being random is astronomical. I believe that even the mass of a particle is secretly mathematically encoded into this Fibonacci wave, and that mass, like everything else, is not a physical property, but merely the result of ingenious superintelligent programming. In this circular state, the Fibonacci 60-digit wave is being held in perfect balance. All the forces of nature are encoded into this wave, all in a single primordial entity, exactly as science predicted. Only not as a physical force as they imagine, but rather in the form of mathematically encoded information. In this balanced state, the wave has no electrical charge and no mass. It is simply a mathematical packet of potential simulated energy. This circular wave of information will then collapse into a perfect hypotenuse triangle as seen in part 9 of this series. That triangle of mathematical information will then form the particles used to construct the virtual universe we see around us. The universe is not created from physical forces that magically manifest out of thin air. It is constructed using mathematical information encoded into waves of time. This mathematical information is not stored on a physical hard drive like the virtual worlds on a computer, but exists only as waves of information that manifest in cycles of time. The universe takes up no physical space and has no size or form. Once this wave of information collapses into the hypotenuse triangle, see part 9 of this series, the forces are no longer held in equilibrium across the nucleus of a circle, and they split into the 4 simulated forces of nature. The virtual particle or triangle of information will now have a virtual mass that was intrinsically mathematically encoded into it. This is what simulates gravity. There are no mysterious missing particles like gravitons. This is why gravity between two objects is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between their centers of mass. And why it can be mathematically calculated. It's all finely tuned math. I will end this video here. To quickly summarize, all 4 of the fundamental forces of nature are encoded into the Fibonacci 60-digit clock. When this wave of time collapses into the Fibonacci 60-digit hypotenuse triangle, the 4 forces become separated. Bear in mind that in this video, I only demonstrated how one Fibonacci 60-digit clock can be rotated 90 degrees. You have to imagine an infinite field of these cycles or waves running 90 degrees to each other. Then you will have an infinite, eternal mathematical canvas on which to paint the universe. In the next video, we will continue to put the pieces of this great puzzle together and see how it correlates to the mainstream scientific version of creation, and what the collapsed Fibonacci 60-digit hypotenuse triangular particle really is. If you are intrigued by these videos, click like and share, and remember to subscribe so you can follow this profound, divinely inspired account of how the universe is not a physical entity, but merely manifests through waves of time for all eternity. And remember to watch and even re-watch all the older videos in this series. They are all connected and all form part of the bigger picture. See you soon.